Hey Bob,
Hey, Raf.
how's it going?
It's going all right. How are you?
I'm swell. Thanks for being on.
Happy to be here.
So, Screenagers, welcome back to another episode of the Canon. We've got Bob here. If you listened to last week's episode, you might be wondering, why the hell is Bob here? And if you are, that's not very nice. Bob is awesome. We love having Bob on the show. But Bob is here. He graciously decided to step in as our, I don't want to say backup, and I don't want to say replacement, but Bob did step in to fill the shoes of RJ and Sailor, who were originally going to be on for this episode to talk to me about Monty Python and the Holy Grail. However, we ran into, just to give you guys like a little peek behind the curtain, we ran into a whole host of issues when, trying to set up some recording time with RJ and with Sailor. We had tech issues, there were vacations involved, and just a whole bunch of other stuff. So unfortunately, no RJ, no Sailor, but fortunately we do have Bob. And fortunately, there are many other episodes this season, and some of them will include RJ, some of them will include Sailor, but we are very happy to have Bob here. So I feel like, Bob, since you are really, stepping up in a way that and stepping in a way that wasn't always expected, I just want to give you a little round of applause because you deserve it.
Well, thank you. I thought there was going to be a soundboard.
Oh, is it not playing?
No, not for me.
Oh, damn it.
Have you got a wah wah sound effect?
No, I think you know what? I don't think I connected the soundboard. We're already recording, so that's embarrassing. I guess I could.
I think
go
that's
back and add
funny
it in
myself.
post.
Yes, absolutely. But then you got to cut this whole part out.
Yeah, no, I think it's funnier if we just do it this way. More technical issues.
Right.
The trend continues. That's okay. We'll get past it. We'll move past it. You know what? We're 2 episodes in for this season, and I'm already losing my mind. So
Oh no.
I think that's a good sign for what's to come the rest of the season. But I will try to regain my sanity for the rest of this episode, even though we're going to be talking about a movie that is insanely funny, one of the most insanely funny movies of all time. We are, of course, going to be talking about Monty Python and the Holy Grail, which is a mouthful. So I will probably be referring to it as just Holy Grail for the remainder of the episode. Bob, I think we can jump right in. We can talk about this movie. I feel like there is a good amount to talk about here. Like I said, this is one of the funniest movies of all time, a classic comedy. If you haven't seen it, listener, maybe pause this right now and go and listen, or go and watch that movie, and then come back once you've heard all the jokes, seen all the gags, understand what it is that Bob and I are going to be talking about here, and then you can laugh along with us. And this is the point in the show where I would hit the laughing sounder on the soundboard, but that's not working. So, Bob, the Monty Python comedy troupe. Before we get into the movie, did you have like any sort of relationship with Monty Python before coming to this, or are you someone who like only knows of Monty Python through this movie, and that like did that open the doors to the rest of their work for you?
No, it's definitely the other way around. I actually came to this movie late in my Python viewing because I'm a Gen X kid. My first experience with Monty Python was staying up on, I'm going to say it was Friday nights, to watch PBS, where they had like a block of British TV shows. And it was like Doctor Who and maybe Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and then Monty Python. And Monty Python was the goal. Like I would sometimes catch Doctor Who, and I would sometimes sit through Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. But the whole reason to stay up that late for me was so I could see this crazy, funny, completely different show that I couldn't get anywhere else. And nobody in my school knew what the hell this was. Nobody else was watching this show. Had no, and you cannot explain the fish slapping dance to a 8th grader and have them have any idea what they just look at you like you're crazy.
Yeah.
And the sad thing is that I discovered many years later that my dad, who my parents had gotten divorced, so he wasn't in the house at the time, was also doing the same thing. He loves Monty Python. He's a huge Monty Python fan. And I didn't know this until I was in my 30s. And I always felt like that was a missed opportunity, you know, that here was something that we could have shared that might have, you know, we didn't always share a lot of the same things. So it would have been cool had we known this about each other earlier. But now we know and we share, and I give him Monty Python gifts and that sort of thing. So
I
yeah,
love that.
Came to it after the show.
See, okay, you've had like deep appreciation for, or had deep appreciation for Monty Python and everything that they were doing before you came around to seeing this movie. So for those who maybe aren't familiar with like what they were doing on the show, the types of sketches and skits and bits that they were doing, myself included, I have never, like, my exposure to Monty Python is very limited. So why don't you just give us like a quick overview of like some of the highlights of what they were doing in that show and like what made their style of comedy so special?
The Monty Python kind of humor it's a little hard to describe. It's a surrealistic, satirical look on. You can't even say it's like in any relation to everyday life. It's just that somebody in the troupe would have an idea about something. Say a guy goes into a shop to buy a parrot. Mm-hmm. It's patently obvious that the parrot is dead, but the clerk tries to sell it to him anyway. So you're like, how is that funny? But it's one of the classic and funniest skits that they have. And it's partly how smart it's written. One of the great things about Monty Python was they never explain anything to you. They always assume that you're smart enough to get where they're coming from. And then 2, they don't care if you find it funny or not. Mm-hmm. If it's funny to them, they'll just sell it straight. And that's part of what makes it funny as well, because it's so absurdist in its context and content that when somebody like John Cleese, who is an accomplished writer and actor outside of Monty Python, but when he goes and does a Monty Python skit, like one of his most famous ones is something called The Ministry of Silly Walks.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I've seen that one.
Yeah. So he plays it completely straight. There's this man with a completely serious face, looks something like maybe an accountant, which his father wanted him to become instead of a comedian and writer. And he's doing the most ridiculous thing you've ever seen an adult human being do. And it's that straightness also that sells things. Yeah. So and you know, one skit could be about like old lady gangs terrorizing young men in rural Britain, and then the next one could be about the Spanish Inquisition just showing up at people's houses. You know, and torturing them with Oh yeah. But it's anything would go. And as long as it was written smartly and it made other people in the troupe laugh, it would go into the show.
Yeah.
And somehow it found an audience.
I mean, do you think that there do you think that like British humor and American humor are like often at odds with each other, and like what is funny to British audiences isn't always funny to American audiences? Do you think that Monty Python like was able to sort of cross that barrier in ways that other British humor like wasn't really able to? And if so, do you think it's because they were doing like not like high level comedy, but like a really smart, clever kind of comedy, even though it was super absurd at the same time?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm trying to think of like what were the big kind of comedies in the like early 70s, mid 70s things. You have, in America, one of the most celebrated humorous films is Airplane,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that's just nonstop gags, just constant jokes coming, but it's still set into a narrative.
Mm-hmm.
And for the British humor, at least in the start, when Monty Python was just doing the shows, it was more punchy and more situational, and and like you said, it was very smartly written, but it was, it could be dumb as a bag of hammers as well.
Yeah.
But some of it's just a guy in a stupid costume talking like this. And you're like, why is this funny? That's not necessarily any funnier than the one about the chocolate company that sells chocolates that are full of the most horrendous sorts of things, but describing them lovingly as if they were the tastiest things on earth. I just feel like there was a lot more physical comedy
Mm-hmm.
in America at the time. I'm thinking of things like Cannonball Run,
Mm-hmm.
and even things that were somewhat more straight, like Smokey and the Bandit, and those sorts of things. But
I wonder if there's like something to, and I haven't like, I'm not like a comedy historian or anything, so this is all just weird theorizing, but I wonder if there's something to Monty Python and its appeal in the States, because I feel like a lot of Americans do really love Monty Python and like their style of humor in ways that, again, a lot of British humor just like does not translate over here to the States, where like a lot of their humor is so silly and absurd, but because it's like packaged in this British, not even like posh or like aristocratic, sort of like styling, but like just hearing people with British voices like do silly things. I wonder if like that like disconnect is what makes it so funny to a lot of Americans. And I guess to then sort of like take it to this movie, right? Like this is kind of like could be a historical drama, and in like many aspects is like kind of accurate in its depictions of, medieval England, but it's so silly. So it's like what like should be this sort of like highbrow, intelligent sort of subject matter, but it's presented in this really silly way. And like maybe that's why it works for us so well, but I don't know if there's like actually anything to that, or if I'm even like describing their humor in the right way.
no, I think you actually are, and that's an interesting way of looking at it. I know that they felt like the humor that they did, and that came out of a bunch of post-war Reconstruction stuff where everything was kind of very austere and everything had to be just so, and everything was restrained. And so when they started going to school and stuff, that was finally starting to loosen up. And a lot of their initial comedy was kind of, I think John Cleese has called it angry comedy, where it was directed at the very things that we think of as of being British. Now, that sort of upper class, a little bit snooty, that sort of things. These were the same sort of things that they disliked about their own, about their own culture. So yeah, I think that definitely seeing, I think one of the skits was called Upper Class Twit of the Year, and that was them making fun of their school days, but it's also making fun of that sort of stuffy British way of looking at things. And yeah, I mean, I'm sure that there's something very American about wanting to see stuffy British people getting either skewered or getting being really ridiculous.
Yeah. No, that's so true. I don't think there's anything that I get more joy out of than seeing stuffy British people get absolutely roasted. Like whether it be like British people in my personal life or just like, I mean, all of my British friends, like most of my conversations with them are just like telling them, how annoyingly snooty they are and why our American way of life is so much better, and constantly citing 1776 and whatnot. It's just like something that is like so like it feels like so deeply American, the like need to like bring proper British culture down a peg. And it was like Monty Python was doing that from within the system, which is why I think it appeals to us so much.
Yeah.
We might be tapping into something.
Yeah.
All right. So let's get to this movie specifically. So Bob, as a sort of lifelong Monty Python fan, do you have any sort of understanding of like where this movie fits into their larger history as a comedy troupe or anything like that? If not, it's totally cool. We can just like start talking about the movie. But I was curious to hear if you knew about like where this sort of sits within their comedic evolution.
Yeah, a little bit. I know this comes between the third season of Monty Python and their last, the fourth season of Monty Python, and that John Cleese had decided that he wasn't going to come back for the show, but he was definitely interested in doing more stuff with the Python group. They had just gotten into America via PBS. Part of that was reluctance on the part of PBS, because they sat, like some of the people for the PBS Corporation sat down and watched some Monty Python and were like, we can't show this.
Yeah.
That was part of it. But part of it was also that back then, the transferring it from the PAL system, which was how they recorded video at the time, to the NTSC system, which was how we recorded video, was just super expensive. So they had just figured out a way to do that. In fact, I think it was they licensed some of their bits for like an ABC comedy special, and they got enough money from that to pay for the transfer. And then it had made it over to PBS, had become popular on PBS. So they actually made a movie called And Now for Something Completely Different, which came out, I think, in 1974, 75. And it was just some of the funniest skits from the show redone on film. And it had bombed horribly.
Oh, no.
It did no money at all in the United States, but they loved doing it. So they immediately were like, well, we want to make another movie. And the BBC was like, well, no, we're not going to give you any money to do that. But their I don't know if it was their producer or just their contact with the PBS Corporation knew that they were huge with some of the rock bands. So they actually sent like tapes to to Pink Floyd, to Led Zeppelin, asking for money to make this movie. And the band's ponied up. Almost all of that initial budget for Holy Grail came from Led Zeppelin and Pink Floyd, which I find hilarious.
Yeah, that's amazing. Like,
yeah,
Jimmy Page funded this movie.
yeah, yeah. They were all huge fans, apparently. So
yeah, I could see that. I could see the Zeppelin guys, especially, being huge fans of this kind of humor. Like, I could see Bonham just like, laughing his ass off.
Oh yeah,
at all of this stuff. That's so cool. That's amazing.
And because they were essentially the producers, only in the sense of providing investors. Let's say they were investors.
Yeah,
and they didn't want to have anything to do with the making of the movie. They were like, "Here's the money. You go do what you do."
Yeah.
And so they got to make this movie, the first movie that they directed themselves, without any interference from outside forces, for good and for ill.
I would say mostly for good, but we'll circle back on maybe why you're saying for ill.
Okay.
So I think all of this brings us to my favorite question, our favorite question of every episode. Bob, when did you first watch this movie? What was your sort of like initial reaction to it? What do you like? What is your personal connection to this movie?
So I had started college and I still hadn't seen any Monty Python movies. I had watched the shows. I had actually listened to some of the albums that they put out.
That used to be a thing, comedy albums.
Yeah, comedy albums were huge.
Yeah.
But I don't even remember where I got those. I think I had a cousin who might have had some of them. But anyway, I hadn't seen any of the movies, and I finally met up with some people who were like, "Oh, we're Monty Python fans too. Have you seen Holy Grail or Life of Brian or any of that?" And I'm like, "I haven't seen any Monty Python movies." And they were like, like, "Oh my God." And they immediately sat me down and made me watch Holy Grail. And while I distinctly remember the experience of watching Holy Grail and laughing hysterically at it, what I most remember is that the year afterwards, I felt, I had felt like I was the only person that knew who Monty Python was in my small little town in Maine.
Mm-hmm.
And in college, knowing quotes from Holy Grail was like a passport to acceptance everywhere. If you said, bring out your dead, or she's a witch, burn her, or whatever, somebody in the room was going to reply with another quote from the movie, and suddenly you were friends.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
That's the amazing thing about just like how comedy works and like comedy movies is it becomes its own sort of, not love language, but its own sort of like secret code. And if you're in, you're in. And just sitting around and trading favorite lines of dialogue or like joke punchlines from comedy movies becomes like the ultimate form of creating bonds, which, a lot of great movies have a ton of great quotes, but there's something about the funny ones and like comedy movies specifically where when you quote it with someone, it like instantly becomes a connection point, which is like super special.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think with something like Monty Python and the Holy Grail, I feel like this is like sort of an early version of those like secret languages. The modern example that I always think of is I Think You Should Leave, that Netflix show. I don't know if you watched it at all.
I have not.
So I'm also not a huge fan of it, but people who are big fans of it, like when they speak to each other about the show and are quoting it, it's like they're speaking, like they may as well be speaking Mandarin around me. I have no idea what they're talking about. And they think it's the funniest thing. And when you're around it, you feel like such an outcast, like such an outsider. And so I tried to watch a few episodes of it to see like, okay, I want to be, part of this society that is able to quote this show. And I watched it and I was like, you know what? I don't get it at all. It's not for me. But like watching something like Monty Python, and I think for me, I was able to see this movie at like a pretty young age. I probably saw this when I was like 10.
Wow.
But I still remember thinking that it was hilarious. I maybe wasn't finding like the same jokes funny that you were finding, or like the same jokes funny that I find funny now. But still, the whole bit with the night in the forest, tis but a flesh wound, was like to like the one of my first memories of like a comedic, like my comedic sensibilities. That's like one of the first jokes I remember.
That's awesome.
As a kid. And it was something that me and my friends would quote to each other like on the playground. And, there were like maybe 4 or 5 of us in the whole school who had seen this movie, and we're quoting it to each other and like, putting our arms behind our backs and like hopping around on one foot. And while the other one's like, what are you going to do? Bleed on me? And no one else understood what we were doing. But between us, it was like the funniest thing in the world.
Yeah.
So
that's awesome.
It's absolutely great. It's amazing. So we've got sort of the backstory of how this movie came to be, with the Led Zeppelins and Pink Floyds of the world funding it. We've got sort of your first time coming to the movie as like a comedic movie. How do you think this holds up? Because I feel like that's always the question. How does this movie hold up today in the year 2024?
Well, having just watched it for the first time in a while, to me, it still holds up. It's still a freaking hilarious movie. The jokes all still land. In fact, there are things that I find funny now that I didn't find as funny before. Mm-hmm. I went into it thinking, this is probably one of the top 10 funniest movies I've ever seen. And I came out of it thinking, this is probably like one of the top 3 funniest movies I've ever seen.
Yeah.
So to me, it's still a classic. Like Maureen's, my wife Maureen's favorite is still Life of Brian.
Mm-hmm.
But for whatever reason, I find this to be a little more out there, a little sillier, a little crazier, a little looser. So for me, this one is still the best of the Python films.
Yeah. This movie is kind of not fast and loose, but the one thing that I was thinking about while rewatching this is just sort of like the style of comedy movies that we get, especially today, and not to become like old man yelling at clouds about how everything these days is like awful and we need to go back to the good old days. But there's something about the format of just, we have this sort of like very loose narrative structure. We have this world that we can play in, this sandbox of this, like King Arthur tale, where we can allow it to just set up a series of bits, a series of gags, and there will be that like connective tissue all throughout. So it doesn't just feel like we're just like throwing everything at the wall and it's like a bunch of nonsense that doesn't really mean anything, or like doesn't have any connection to its other parts. But like the fact that this movie is just bit after bit after bit after bit after bit, and there's like no room for any BS that is not comedy, is so amazing. And I feel like it's kind of a lost art. I don't know if you feel the same way.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I'm not sure if that's just because part of this is that they grew out of a live performance background. They all started writing for television in the mid to late 60s. Mm-hmm. And then of course Python itself was was shot live as well. And there's a certain risk taking that you have that I think people are not trained to do that anymore. Like wherever people are getting trained to do comedy and write comedy now, and there are funny things. There are plenty of funny movies out there. This is going to sound weird, but I'm in the middle of watching Beau is Afraid, and I had no idea that it was a comedy.
Yeah.
But it's a funny movie.
Yeah. 100%.
Yeah, but it's not the same kind of film. Like you said, this sort of just gag after gag after gag after gag. No, and everything still holds together.
Mm-hmm.
There's kind of this narrative structure that it holds on. Doesn't always make sense or anything, but it's that density of comedy is not something. Everything's all kind of expanded now. Everything takes longer, and I don't know.
Yeah, there are all those in between moments where we're just sort of like waiting for, whatever the next jokes will be. And I don't know, maybe it's just a different kind of like comedic structure. But in terms of a movie that I'm trying to think of like the most recent example of movies that were like really just like bit after bit after bit, gag after gag after gag. And the last example that I can think of were those like really weird series of spoof movies in like the mid aughts or like early aughts, like adventure movie or whatever they were called, sort of like everything.
Oh yeah.
Or like scary movie.
Yep.
And those movies all exist as like series of bits, but bits that are very much so like references to other movies. So I mean, those don't work for like several reasons. But like, yeah, just the commitment to such a like density of gags, and like the narrative structure of this movie is like, okay, and then this character went to this place, and the only reason that they're going to that place is so that we can set up this like this gag that we had that we wanted to do here.
Yeah, but even like this individual scenes will have just layers of stuff that's not even part of the scene. Real, like the thing that I'm thinking of is one of the early scenes is the "Bring Out Your Dead" scene where they're bringing a cart through the town. It's obviously plague time, and the whole bit is that John Cleese's character is bringing an old man that's not dead yet. He's about to be, but that's the whole bit. But in the background, there are all these things going on. One, it's a perfectly realized medieval town. It's like it's absolutely authentic feeling. And then you have something ridiculous like an old lady in the background just swinging a live cat against a wall. And it's not. She just bangs it against the wall twice and then goes up the stairs, I'm like laughing my ass off, but it's not related to the scene. It's just one more level of comedy that somebody was like, I want an old lady swinging a cat against the wall. Okay, let's throw it in. I think it'll be funny.
Those are the best comedies, right? Where you rewatch it and there's a new joke that you didn't catch the first time or the last 5 times that you watched.
Right. Oh yeah, like that particular thing, that old lady shows up again later with the cat. And I hadn't realized that was the same person.
It's so good. It's so funny. I think another really impressive part of that whole like idea of how committed to the comedy the Monty Python crew was for this movie is the opening credits are themselves. That's a gag. That's like its own bit. Before the movie even starts, we're doing bits. And that's hard to make that joke work. I hadn't seen this movie in a while. So when I was rewatching it for this, I always watch movies with subtitles on. And those like Dutch or Swedish or whatever whatever language that's supposed to be, those subtitles are popping up. And I was like, did I change my Netflix settings to Dutch subtitles? Did I leave my Netflix account signed in some like, in some like Amsterdam Airbnb or something? What the hell is going on here? And then I realized like, no, this is bit. They're doing bit. And it's absolutely hysterical. The whole thing is amazing.
I know. And that's just Eric Idle going, this is the most boring part of every movie, sitting through the credits. Let's do something.
Yeah. And then you end with what is it, like the llama credits or like
yes,
the alpaca? So good. Okay, so Bob, I have to ask the question. I feel like it's just standard for any comedic movie. Which bit, which gag, which joke is your favorite?
Oh geez. That's the whole bit with the rabbit. I include the bit with the enchanter Tim before that, because that's genius as well. But once they get there and the whole, I soiled my armor, I was so scared. And the holy hand grenade of Antioch, and that whole section just kills me every time.
Yeah, that bit is hysterical.
Yeah.
Originally, when I was planning to do this episode with RJ and Sailor gave us the prompt to guess which one gag gets him every time, and RJ and I were to guess which one it was, and he would reveal it. While I was rewatching, I had a feeling, and I still feel like Sailor would be big on the rabbit bit.
Yeah, but I'm gonna guess, and maybe he'll tell us, maybe he won't, but I'm gonna guess it's the witch.
The witch. Oh, when they're like in the town square.
Yeah. The burn her and all of that bit. And John Cleese. When I was watching it, it made me realize how good John Cleese is as an actor, because he was making me giggle without saying anything, just the expressions on his face.
Yeah.
In that scene. But yeah.
That is a great bit. That scene also really like highlights the sort of like high level comedy that they're doing. So much of this movie and like so much of what's funny about it is the fact that they are doing all of these series of gags, and within the gags there are smaller jokes, there are layered jokes, there are jokes happening in the background, jokes happening in the foreground, callbacks to other jokes. But then the movie as a whole is like designed to really make fun of medieval times and like what England was in that past. And that scene in particular with the burning of the witch, it's like very apparent what they're doing with the whole movie, but then it sort of like recontextualizes just sort of like what these guys sort of thought about that whole period of time in history.
Yeah. And I think that at that time period, I may be wrong about this, but I seem to vaguely remember reading something about one of the things they wanted to make fun of and puncture was this whole sort of movement in England at the time to sort of mythologize all of this and to make it some mythical time period where England and everything was so much better. But they're like, no, it wasn't. Everything was crap and filled with filth, and the divine right of kings was bullshit, and all of this thing, excuse my language, and that whole conversation about watery tarts distributing swords is no basis for system of government is just perfect for that sort of, here's something about this that we just accepted, and which is ridiculous.
Yeah. just like really just like poking all of the possible holes in that entire period of time. And I know before we started recording, we said that we weren't going to go the academic route because we don't feel super qualified to. But if I may sort of take a stab,
Yeah.
I think there's an interesting thing happening with that whole like England trying to mythologize this whole period of time where, so like in the States, in maybe the generation prior, the States is doing a whole lot of celebrating the time of the Old West, the cowboy narrative, all that kind of stuff, and really like glorifying and romanticizing that from like the 50s through, like the 60s. In Japan, you've got like a really similar thing happening with their own feudal period and samurai stories galore, and a lot of romanticizing and glorifying that and using that to then like understand what it means to be either a modern day American or Japanese person. I don't know how much of that was necessarily happening across like Europe at the time, but like to think that England was seeing that happening in these other two nations and is like totally feeling its sort of like grip on the world as being like the dominant world power slipping away, and trying to like look back at that period to be like, oh, things were so great then. And, that like led to the British Empire, which was, so amazing for everyone. Even though it wasn't. And then these guys coming along and they're like, no, this is all bullshit. And we should make fun of how BS all of that was. I think I'm taking too much of a leap, but I do think that there is something like kind of interesting there.
No, and I absolutely agree. And these guys are all, except for Terry Gilliam, they're like Cambridge and Oxford educated guys who have this grounding in the classics and in history, especially British history. And so they're not just making these attacks willy-nilly. They're coming from a place of understanding what these things are and what they represent and what they are, why they need to be skewered and made fun of. So I think that that's absolutely the case. And I love the way you pointed out the way Westerns were for the US and the way samurai films are for Japan. I hadn't made that connection before, but it's obvious now. So.
And England had Monty Python and the Holy Grail.
Right. Just that.
Everyone had their thing. But you bring up a great point in that it's easy to tell that they are making fun of all of medieval England from a place of understanding like what it was, and not just sort of like taking stabs at it. There is like such a deep understanding. It like almost feels, well, not almost, like you were saying, these guys are all, we're all educated in like history and the classics and whatnot. So you can tell that there's like a deep understanding. It's like written by historians, but historians who are really freaking funny.
Yeah. And historians that are not getting struck down by knights.
Yeah, exactly. And so like that whole joke is like a super like meta thing that's happening over the course of the story. What do you think of that bit and that whole like running joke throughout?
I like it better now than I did when I first saw it, because like I can't remember if it was Michael Palin or Eric Idle. One of them said that the ending of the movie, when the cops show up and arrest, I think it's just Arthur and Terry Jones's character. I can't remember which night he is, and they just put a hand in the camera and that's the end of the movie.
Yeah.
That pissed me off so much when the first time that I saw it. And apparently either Michael Palin or Eric Idle's daughter is like, this turns one of the best movies of all time into the worst movie of all time.
Oh, wow.
But watching it now, they build to this. you know,
Mm-hmm.
and it's you could see it as a comment on historians trying to provide a context for the real past
Hmm.
get killed by the idealized version of the past in the form of the night that comes by. I love that we never know which night it is too.
Yeah.
And then that the police and the detectives are all tracking down who killed history. You
Wow.
know,
It was,
so
yeah.
I like it now, but I hated it when I first saw it.
That's yeah, that's such an interesting reading of it. And who would have thought that we would be here talking about Monty Python and the Holy Grail in these deep, semi academic sort of ways, and like I don't think anyone's ever theorized about Monty Python and the Holy Grail as much as we're doing right now.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. Probably too much. If Monty Python were here, they would be like, "Oh, for crying out loud!"
Yeah, these
Just pull the other one.
jackasses. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, to get us away from that, I will say making fun of French people is always funny, and making fun of French accents when they're speaking English is like will always, that and like poop jokes will always get me.
Yeah. So you combine the two,
Yeah.
and it's fantastic.
Yeah, fart in your general direction.
In your general direction. Yeah. It's
That's peak comedy.
yeah.
That's peak comedy.
Nobody can sell that accent like Cleese, though. Holy crap.
No. Oh my god.
So good.
That was another one when I was like 10 that I didn't really like know why it was so funny, but what is it? Your mother was a hamster and your father smelled of elderberries is like,
Yes.
I didn't know what that meant, but like I would say that to people all the time and they would be like, what the hell are you talking about?
That's the perfect insult.
Perfect insult, because it's like, you know that it's mean, but it's like not mean enough to get offended. Yeah. It's so confusing. You're just sort of like left like kind of perplexed. What do you mean my father was a hamster?
Yeah.
Yeah, making fun of French people, just that's the easiest way to make someone laugh.
I apologize for my cat yowling, by the way.
Is your cat French?
Apparently, she's just looking for my wife right now.
Poor kid.
Anyway,
no, an amazing guest appearance. We not the first cat that we've had on the show.
No,
but the first time your cat has been on the show, I think, or has she made an appearance in the past?
I don't remember her being on before, but she's insistent. So
yeah, a lot of cats, a lot of screen age cats, which we love to hear.
And Jacob's dogs.
And Jacob's dogs, yeah, exactly. I might have to get a cat just to fit in.
Don't do it.
No, not worth it. All right, Bob. I can't really think of too many other items in this movie that I specifically want to hit. Is there anything that you wanted to bring up that we haven't already touched on?
A couple of minor things. The capital of Assyria, depending on the time frame, was either Assur or Nineveh. Important
Good to know.
Questions to know. The airspeed velocity of an unladen European swallow is 20.1 miles per hour.
Also good information to know.
Yeah. And my favorite color is green. So these are important.
You may pass.
Excellent. One other minor thing that I discovered during this is that they had actually had a budget for a soundtrack, for a score, and they did score the movie, and then their first previews, people didn't laugh.
Interesting.
Like they laughed at the credits and they laughed at the very first scene with Arthur and is it Pansy? I can't. No, not Pansy.
I forgot. Something with a C, maybe? I don't know. I can't remember.
Anyway, when they come up, they laughed at that, and then it was silent for the rest of the movie. And they decided that the music was too appropriate. Like it worked with the scenes too well, and it became less of a comedy and more of a straightforward movie for people, and they weren't getting the jokes. So they tossed most of the score and rescored it with just library music.
Interesting.
People started laughing again. So I just thought that was pretty funny.
That's really cool. Yeah.
One last thing. This was directed by both Terry Jones and Terry Gilliam at the same time. So that apparently was early on in the episode. We talked about how this was both that they did this for good or for ill, that they were allowed to make this movie the way they wanted. And part of that ill was that the two Terrys had completely different ways of directing a movie. And they would have like one of them would set something up in the morning and then be contradicted by the other in the evening. And John Cleese in particular found Terry Gilliam. He was like, Gilliam he's a genius, but at the time he was way too used to directing paper because he was the animator on the TV show, and not so good at moving people who had to actually make the shapes he was trying to get.
Yeah,
in a film.
Yeah, that's fair. Insane that this was half directed by the dude who directed Brazil.
Right. Right. Like Eric Idle is like, I swore I would never do another movie with Terry Gilliam, and then somehow got talked into Baron Munchausen.
Like insane. This is an insane entry in his filmography.
It is indeed.
Yeah.
But amazing. They both learned how to make a movie making this movie. That it came out as good as it did is kind of amazing. And unlike their previous film of all their sketches, this did gangbuster business. It was number one in the US and made millions of dollars. It was
nice.
Huge.
As it should have. That's awesome that this movie was that big. I didn't know that at all. So the reception was pretty good here.
Yeah. Yeah. I have to ask, because hopefully is this the only Monty Python film in the canon?
This is the only Monty Python film in the canon. This is also the only Monty Python movie that I've seen. I'm not super familiar with anything else that they've done. I feel like people always tell me I should see Life of Brian, but I think I got really lucky in seeing this movie so young that it really informed a lot of my comedic sensibilities going forward, and has been able to be something that I'm always able to come back to and sort of laugh at and laugh with in a way that I'm not sure if I would still appreciate it necessarily if it were something that I had watched for the first time, for the show.
Right.
I mean, that's another really interesting thing about comedy. Just I guess that could be said of any text of any kind, or any form of media, is, making sure that you engage with it for the first time in the right time in your life. Otherwise it won't click.
Right.
But I feel like comedy specifically. So I'm grateful that I watched this movie when I did.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. It would be interesting to show this to a bunch of people who had never seen any Monty Python now, and just see how, if at all, it hit. So,
yeah. Again, going back to that, does it hold up question? I think this one benefits from not being as inappropriate or problematic as like other comedies from yesteryear have been.
Right.
And I feel like a lot of times when we're asking that question, it's like, oh, you can't make comedy anymore because, you know, everyone gets offended. It's like, no, you could still make a movie like this today where it's really smart. It's like a very dense amount of jokes, and you are committed to the jokes in their silliness in a way, and like have them delivered all straight. I think that's the other thing with something like this, is that they're never really played. The jokes are never really played like jokes by the actors or even like with the direction of the movie. And it's just like the words and the situations themselves that makes everything so funny. So yeah, like something like this movie could certainly still be made, and I think would still make a lot of people laugh.
Yeah, no, I agree. I just don't know if there's a group or even individuals that are capable of making this sort of.
No, I don't think so. You know, our best and brightest are, you know, Harvard and Yale educated comedians are all writing like subpar jokes for SNL.
Right. Yeah.
You know,
Yeah. Not
it's
wrong.
it's like they're not writing this like really cool sort of like high concept comedy that also has such density of silliness at the same time. It's just sort of like a flat silliness that we get. Do better, Harvard. Do better, Yale. I don't think there are any funny people who go to Princeton, so we don't expect anything from them.
Okay, challenge thrown.
Yeah, who knows if it is accepted. Ivies, you have 10 days to respond.
Yeah. Think you're safe, honestly.
But Bob, something that you brought up does bring me to sort of my last question for this particular movie. What do you think the like lasting legacy of Monty Python and the Holy Grail is? Like, do you think Monty Python has influenced comedy troupes of today, or like comedy groups that we have seen in the last, 40, 50 years or whatever? Do you think that their style of comedy has sort of like lived on through other comedic minds? Or do you think that it's just like it has been super hard to replicate, and like that's why it's essential? Or do you think it's essential because of like its lasting influence?
That's an interesting question to. It requires, I think, a little bit more awareness of modern humor than I have. I know that their influence is pretty wide, as far as a lot of people have said that they've felt like Monty Python and this movie in particular have influenced them in some way. Edgar Wright, for instance, has mentioned
Mm-hmm.
that he feels like his sense of humor was somewhat formed around these sorts of Monty Python films. But other than that, I feel like it was lightning in a bottle. They were something that happened that couldn't be replicated again. There are other types of comedies. I feel like you can romantic comedies, sorry, Ramona, are full of repetitive formulas for creating jokes and for comedy in general. But this particular group, I don't think nothing ever came close to producing the kind of the level of quality, the consistency, and just the classics that Monty Python did. I can't think of any off the top of my head.
No. Yeah, I tried thinking of some who could, like, you could maybe draw either a direct line or some sort of like indirect line to Monty Python, and I couldn't think of anyone. I couldn't brainstorm any groups. There's a lot of like really sort of like really absurdist, surreal kind of like internet
Yes.
comedy groups, like Whitest Kids You Know, whatever the group was called that Donald Glover was in. But those are just like really like hyper surreal to
Right.
a point of silliness and absurdity where it's hard to say that there is like any intelligence in the writing, because it's just
Right.
like, okay, let's just create the most absurd situation ever
I know.
and like
Yeah.
take it from there, and just sort of like not like a yuck factor, but just sort of like beat the laughs out of you by how absurd it is, as opposed to like earning the laughs, which I feel like Monty Python does. But going back to the Edgar Wright example, I do think that the like Cornetto trilogy or Cornetta trilogy,
Yep.
that's like maybe the closest thing that we've had to this kind of humor. Like Hot Fuzz is like in many ways like, you know,
Right.
a version of Monty Python and the Holy Grail, where it's like taking like a sort of like this concept and making fun of it on a high level, but then also having these like hilarious series of gags throughout. Not sure if it's like on the same level, but I can see the influence there more so than in other forms of like modern day comedy.
Yeah. I agree. I was, while you were mentioning that, I was like, the movies that I was thinking that are closest to this for American, I already mentioned Airplane, the Zucker brothers uh, stuff, and they did like the Naked Gun movies, and but for whatever reason, I was remembering Ghostbusters was, at least when it came out, was like one of the funniest movies I had ever seen. It's not the same level as far as, it's not gag after gag after gag. It's much more story driven.
Yeah.
But Ivan Reitman and Harold Ramis and Dan Aykroyd actually did a good job with that as well.
Absolutely.
But and then there's the Kids in the Hall stuff, and that was the 90s, I think. That particular troupe was also very surreal and more intellectual. Some of it. Some of it, but it didn't have the same impact. Can't think of anything else that's had that impact. But
yeah. So I guess that's our answer. This movie is essential because it's been impossible to replicate. It stands on its own in the comedy genre as this sort of like unreachable, unattainable sort of level of comedic perfection, really. It's like, it's hard to call it anything but that. And it sounds like hyperbole, but it's in the canon for a reason. And part of it's because it's, it is what it is.
Yeah, it's unique. Yeah.
For lack of having anything better to say.
It is what it is.
It is what it is. All right. Amazing. Well, Bob, thank you again for joining me for this episode. This has been, I think, a more thoughtful discussion on Monty Python and the Holy Grail, certainly than what I was expecting, and I'm sure what many of our listeners were expecting. I hope that we didn't bore you with our theorizing about the philosophy of comedy or any of that stuff. Like, it's placed within the history of mythologizing nations across the globe. I hope we were able to mix in enough laughs to keep people interested. Before we say our final goodbyes, let's run through our recommendations. So, just in case we have any new listeners out there, for every movie that we introduce into the canon, we also recommend 3 things to check out if you like said movie. At least one of those things has to be another movie. The other 2 things, however, can be any and everything. It could be an album. It could be a musician. It could be a painting. It could be a book. It could be a TV show. It could be a season of TV, an episode of TV. It can be a restaurant. It could be like truly anything. We like to get really creative, really weird. The connections to the movie can be as loose or as on the nose as we like. We sometimes like to get very creative with the connective tissue. The only thing that we ask is that for any movies that are recommended, we don't recommend any other movies that are in the canon. So no Airplane, no Ghostbusters, but pretty much everything else is fair game. So with all that being said, Bob, I would like for you to kick us off. What is your first recommendation for the Holy Grail?
I just started panicking because I forgot that one of the recommendations had to be a movie.
Oh no!
And I was like,
well,
I got all my stuff listed here, and then suddenly realized, oh crap! So
since you are
no,
here,
don't bend the rules for me again.
No, I'm bending the rules. It's okay. Give us your 3 recommendations, all non-movies.
Okay. All right. I'm going to take and run with it. That's fine. So, my first recommendation is the most obvious recommendation, although there's a little stinger in it for additional related to this moviness, and that is Monty Python's Flying Circus, the TV show.
Nice.
It is essential viewing for a foundational television comedy show. It's full of just all kinds of crazy, humorous things. If you liked the Holy Grail, you will love probably 50% of Flying Circus. There's stuff that is just incredible genius writing and comedy in there. One of the interesting things is that season 4, which does not feature John Cleese, does have its second episode features a writing credit by him, because the first half of that episode is actually outtakes from one of the first drafts of the Holy Grail. So the initial setting, the initial draft had half of the movie taking place in present day and half taking place in medieval times. And the present day would have the knights looking for the Holy Grail in a Harrods department store. So
I'd watch that.
Yeah. So that there's some of that was adapted for the first half of episode 4.2, the second episode of season 4. So worth checking out if you weren't aware of that.
That's how about that, huh?
Yeah. That's right.
Yeah. Episode 2 of season 4 of the canon.
Oh my God.
Episode 2 season 4 of Monty Python. How about that?
Yep. And you went on a quest to find a guest to come on your show.
You were my Holy Grail for this episode.
Oh my God. I'm so sorry.
I didn't know that I needed you, but I went on a quest and found you. That's amazing. I love it. Amazing first pick. In a way, the sort of like initial draft of what this movie was going to be is kind of somewhat related to my first recommendation, which is a French comedy film from the 90s about medieval knights who somehow find their way traveling to present day, like 1993 France. And it's like also kind of a political comedy where it's like making fun of more so French society, like in the early 90s, as opposed to like French medieval times, but also kind of making fun of that the same way that this movie is making fun of English medieval times. I don't know if you've seen it or heard of it, Bob, but it's called The Visitors, or Les Visiteurs in French. I think a lot of the humor is sort of like lost in translation, but it is still a very, very, very hysterical movie.
Yeah. And it's weird that you mentioned this, because I think I watched it specifically because a friend of mine that liked Monty Python said I should give it a shot.
Yeah.
And I remember enjoying it, but I don't remember anything else about it. So I should check it out again.
You should check it out again. I when I watch it with two French people and two other Americans. And the Americans, we were like, oh yeah, this is funny. And we were like laughing from time to time. And the French people were like howling, like they were dying. And for them, they were like, this is a movie that like every French person, like every French millennial has seen like 1,000 times. And it like has totally informed, French humor for that generation. And they were like absolutely losing it. So like that was a fun experience. If you can find some French people to watch it with, Bob, I would highly recommend.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah. Oh, that's right. Jean Reno was in that film. I forgot.
Yeah. Before he became Hollywood's token French guy.
Yeah. No kidding. Man. Cool. Yeah. I remember them destroying the car.
Yes. Yeah.
Cool. Nice. I like that.
Yeah.
Very cool.
What's your second pick?
Okay. My second pick is a little weird. It's a comic book series that kind of gives me some of the same nonstop gags while making fun of a particular genre, in this case, superheroes. It's a comic book called Next Wave Agents of Hate. It was written by Warren Ellis, who I know is a little problematic nowadays, and drawn by Stuart Immonen. It features some second or third string superheroes from the Marvel Universe, like Machine Man and Captain Marvel, but the Marcia Rambeau version of. Anyway, it's just ultra violent. It makes fun of all kinds of superhero tropes. It's just, if you didn't like a joke, turn the page. There's another one on the next page, and it's just nonstop silliness and gags and surrealism. And it makes me laugh every time I read it. So
I like that. And I like that connection to this movie. That's, that's sweet. What's it called again?
It's called Next Wave Agents of Hate.
Nice. Yeah, we all need agents of hate.
Yeah, sometimes we are.
Say that. Yeah, maybe sometimes it feels like we all are agents of hate.
Yeah.
Alrighty. Moving on cheerfully to my recommendation with no hate whatsoever. I'm going to recommend what I'm going to call an experience. I don't know if there are any by you, Bob, but there is this thing all across America. You can hop on your laptop computer, hit the Google machine, and see if there's one by you. And if there is one by you, Bob or listener, I highly recommend going to it. Have you heard of Medieval Times? It is this like interactive dinner show where people, ride horses and joust and duel and fight as if it were medieval times, and you like eat turkey legs with your hands as if it were medieval times, and you drink beers and you cheer for different knights to like win different fights. It's so much fun. An absolute blast. Have you heard of this?
Oh yeah. No, absolutely. The nearest one to me is like a 6-hour drive away. So totally. There isn't one in Maine. I think the nearest one is in Massachusetts. So, but yeah, it's on my bucket list of things to do for sure. It sounds like a blast.
It is so much fun. So yeah, Medieval Times. That's my second recommendation.
That's fantastic. Definitely go check it out if you've got one near you. Cool. All right. So my third and final non-movie recommendation goes back to the Monty Python well in a different way that's more directly related to my specific category of nerddom, which is I play role-playing games. I have a regular game on Sunday nights, and very much enjoy those sorts of things. And someone decided that they would put out a Monty Python role-playing game. It's called Monty Python's Co-Curricular Medieval Reenactment Program. And its default setting is the medieval era of the Holy Grail, but it references and has adaptations of tons of stuff from their other movies and their television shows as well. One of the key features is that in a normal game, you have somebody called a game master who is in charge of running the game. In the Monty Python game, they're known as the head of light entertainment. And if the players don't like the way the game is going, they can be fired, and you will elect a new game master from the other players. So it sounds hilarious. I've not actually played it, but I've been told that it captures the feel of a Monty Python experience while also actually being a functionally playable role-playing game.
That sounds incredible. And the firing thing, we didn't even bring up the person, the people. What is it? The people in charge of the credits have been
sacked.
Have been sacked. Yes, great joke. Amazing. So you can sack the game master, or you can sack whoever's been in charge of being game master. That sounds awesome. You'll have to play that and then report back to us on the show with how it was. That sounds like a ton of fun. Nice. I love that. My third recommendation is not nearly as cool or as fun, but a show that I couldn't stop thinking about while watching this movie is still, to me, like one of the best concepts for a TV show of all time. I'm very upset that it does not still currently run. I think that this show should be around for forever and forever. I am recommending Drunk History. That to me is like the best show ever. That is just like a concept that I love wholeheartedly. Like, absolutely incredible. Have you ever watched it?
I have. Yeah. No, it's a fantastic show, and I hadn't realized that it was no longer being made.
Yeah.
But I mean, I should. It hasn't been made in a while, but I think that I came to it late. Mm-hmm. Like it was a web thing first, and I remember watching the shorts, and then like Paramount got it.
Yeah.
So
it was. I mean, what an amazing concept! Like, have people recite moments in history and stories from history after one too many drinks, and then having people reenact what said drunk person is saying. Yep. Like, just absolute, just beautiful stuff all around.
Oh man, that was another series that was the pandemic kind of put that down, unfortunately.
Yeah. I would love to see that come back. That's up there with French people with French accents in things that make me laugh. All right, Bob, before we say final goodbyes, before we get sacked, let's run through our recommendations one last time. What do you got?
All right. So first recommendation is the series Monty Python, Monty Python's Flying Circus, the progenitor for all of the Monty Python movies that came after it, including this one. My second recommendation was the comic series Next Wave, Agents of Hate by Warren Ellis and Stuart Immonen, just for the nonstop gags, this time at the expense of the superhero genre. And lastly is the Monty Python's co-curricular medieval reenactment program. Don't call it a role-playing game, but it's a role-playing game.
Sweet. I love it. I've got The Visitors, the French comedy from the 90s. I've got the interactive dinner show theater experience Medieval Times all across the country, and the great TV show Gone Too Soon, Drunk History.
Fantastic.
Mr. Bob, Big Bob, as you hate being called, thank you again for joining for this episode. This has been an absolute blast. I'm happy that we got to have you on for this, although we did miss RJ and Sailor.
Yeah.
Like I said on the front end, we will have them back on very soon for more episodes. We'll also be having Bob back on for more episodes. Maybe some in October, definitely, because you are the resident horror guru. So we'll have you on there, or then, and maybe before. Next week, we're going to be talking Paul Thomas Anderson's There Will Be Blood, one of my favorite movies of all time. I absolutely cannot wait for that episode. Got a very special guest who's going to be joining me for that. It's going to be another great discussion, another great movie. So be sure to check us out then. Bob, before we go, anything on the website that you've got lined up that people should be looking out for?
I've got Fear Flashback Fridays, where I review a classic or not so classic horror film every week. Sailor and Kane and I are working on something special for hopefully spooky season.
Nice.
Keep fingers crossed that actually happens. And I think that's it for now. Yeah.
Awesome. I love it. Yeah, definitely check out Fear Flashback Fridays. Those write-ups, those reviews are always great, always super fun. I feel like a lot of the reviews that you give there gives me reminders for movies that I should check out or revisit. So I always love
avoid
if they're too spooky. That's a very good reminder. But yeah, I always love seeing those. So definitely check that out. Like I said, we've got There Will Be Blood next week. We are also now available on YouTube in close to real time. So you might be listening to us on Spotify or Apple or somewhere else where you get your podcasts. You might also be listening to us on YouTube. So we've got episodes coming out every Wednesday on all of your podcasting platforms. And then we're out on Saturdays on YouTube. So Wednesdays, main feed, Saturdays, check us out on YouTube, wherever it is that you're listening to us or maybe watching us. Feel free to leave us reviews and subscriptions and likes and all of that good stuff. It does, help us continue to grow our audience and to get the show to new screenagers, which, we love to do. And then those new listeners can go onto the website and check out Bob's Fear Flashback Fridays and everything else that we have to offer over there. So it's just a lot of fun. There's a lot of movies to talk about, a lot of cool people to talk about movies with. We hope you join us again next week for There Will Be Blood. And in the meantime, we will see you in the wasteland. Bye, y'all.